From the most trusted names in local news, KDPG Sunday Edition.
Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm Ken Rice. This past week was one of the busiest and most critical for President Trump. The president was in Vietnam to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in hopes of reaching an agreement that would see North Korea ending its nuclear weapons program. At the same time, the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, facing prison time for lying to the IRS, financial institutions, and Congress, took center stage testifying on Capitol Hill. As Nancy Cordes reports, Cohen now says he regrets much of the work he did for President Trump.
And nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Like a witness for the prosecution, the president's former fixer and lawyer said he and Mr. Trump committed crimes together.
I am ashamed that I chose to take part in concealing Mr. Trump's illicit acts rather than listening to my own conscience. I am ashamed because I know what Mr. Trump is. He is a racist, he is a con man, and he is a cheat.
With hundreds of people lined up outside, Cohen told the 42 members of the House Oversight Committee that the president broke federal campaign finance laws from the Oval Office.
He asked me to pay off an adult film star with whom he had an affair.
Cohen brought this statement from the personal home equity loan he took out to hide that $130,000 hush payment to Stormy Daniels. He says the president reimbursed him in installments so it would look like a retainer, signing this $35,000 check in mid-2017.
Is there any doubt in your mind that President Trump knew exactly what he was paying for?
There is no doubt in my mind.
Cohen also claimed that the president knew about stolen Clinton campaign emails before WikiLeaks released them.
Mr. Stone told Mr. Trump that he had just gotten off the phone with Julian Assange, and that Mr. Assange told Mr. Stone that within a couple of days there would be a massive dump of emails that would damage Hillary Clinton's campaign. Mr. Trump responded by stating to the effect, "Wouldn't that be great?"
Trump associate Roger Stone and WikiLeaks both denied it today. And Republicans said Cohen, facing 3 years in prison for a slew of federal crimes, shouldn't be believed.
When you filed a false tax return in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016, was all that out of blind loyalty to the president?
No, it was not.
One of Cohen's crimes? To Congress.
Nothing he says or produces has any credibility. Apparently, he even lied about delivering his own child, which his wife had to correct the record of.
Cohen admits he lied to lawmakers about a Moscow real estate deal. Says he did it because he knew that's what Mr. Trump, who he served for a decade, wanted.
He would look me in the eye and tell me there's no Russian business, and then go on to lie to the American people by saying the same thing. In his way, he was telling me to lie.
But he never directed you to lie to Congress.
He did not use those words, no.
Cohen also shared financial documents to demonstrate how Mr. Trump would inflate the value of his assets to rank higher on the Forbes billionaires list, then deflate them in order to pay lower taxes.
And was that done with the president's knowledge or direction?
Everything was done with the knowledge and at the direction of Mr. Trump.
Mr. Cohen, how long did you work in the White House?
I never worked in the White House.
And that's the point, isn't it, Mr. Cohen?
No, sir.
Yes, it is.
With President Trump occupied in Vietnam, it fell to his sons to keep a running commentary on the hearing. Donald Trump Jr. tweeting, "Ha ha ha ha, Michael Cohen begged to work at the White House, and everyone knows it." Cohen claimed their father repeatedly said racist things.
And he told me that black people would never vote for him because they were too stupid.
I've talked to the president over 300 times. I've not heard one time a racist comment out of his mouth in private. So how do you reconcile it? Do you have proof of those conversations?
I would ask you to
Do you have tape recordings of those conversations?
No, sir.
Well, you've taped everybody else. Why wouldn't you have a tape?
That's also not true, sir.
One of his non-answers was revealing, too.
Is there any other wrongdoing or illegal act that you are aware of regarding Donald Trump that we haven't yet discussed today?
Yes, and again, those are part of the investigation that's currently being looked at by the Southern District of New York.
Cohen said he worries now about retribution and regrets his former tactics.
How many times did Mr. Trump ask you to threaten an individual or entity on his behalf?
Quite a few times.
50 times?
More.
100 times?
More.
Well, this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition, what comes next after Cohen's testimony? A little later, we'll also look at the president's efforts to reach an agreement with Kim Jong-un. But right now, reaction to these developments in Washington. We are pleased to welcome Jalila Jefferson Bullock to the KDPG Sunday edition. She's an associate professor of law at Duquesne University and teaches constitutional law. And we welcome back attorney Heather Heidelbaugh, partner with the Pittsburgh firm Leach, Tishman, Fiscaldo, and Lampel, also a former at-large member of Allegheny County Council and a longtime leader in Republican politics. Also joining me is Sally Stapleton, managing editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Sally, nice to have you along.
Thank you.
And welcome to both of you. So first of all, was Michael Cohen credible? Professor, let me put it to you first.
I think so. I think he was quite credible. I think he came off as genuine. I think he came off, it's difficult to say a person is trustworthy when they've been convicted or pled guilty to offenses involving being untruthful. But he came off as having really nothing at this point to lose. He's been sentenced already. He's going to prison very soon. And so in my estimation, he came off as completely credible, as a credible insider giving very important information about the character of President Trump.
Heather, you agree?
I agree. I think he can file a Rule 35 motion to have increased leniency on his sentence. So there would be a motivation for him, if the Democrats control Congress, for him to be more forthcoming in their viewpoint. However, I completely agree with the professor that, most people don't lie about everything. Most people don't fail to tell the truth all the time. I thought he was credible. I thought he had hard evidence that he brought. And I think he wants to change his life.
So let me ask you if you agree or disagree with this assessment. Alex Wagner is a CBS News correspondent. She also writes for The Atlantic. She wrote that the image of the signed check from the president in office, the $35,000 payment to Michael Cohen, which he says was partial reimbursement for the payment to Stormy Daniels. Alex Wagner said, quote, "This was O.J.'s glove and Obama's birth certificate, a tangible evidentiary bombshell that signaled perhaps the turning of the tide. We'll be seeing images of that check for years to come, maybe end up in our history books." Professor, agree or disagree?
Well, it certainly was an explosive piece of information, but if we're talking about impeachment perhaps being the next step, that type of information does not necessarily lead to an impeachment of a sitting president, and so people need to be made aware of that, although it's important, and it certainly does signal perhaps criminal activity, but not an impeachable offense.
Heather, isn't it sort of baked into the cake already? I felt like, okay, now we're seeing this tangible evidence of it, but I think, haven't most people already sort of been under the belief that the president, even though he's denied it, had an affair with Stormy Daniels, made this payment, arranged with Michael Cohen, which he pleaded to, which he discussed with prosecutors in the Southern District of New York?
So the first comment that you made, here we are seeing tangible evidence. As a trial lawyer, you have he said, she said, and what you're always trying to do is you're trying to get documentary evidence. And so the reason why I think Michael Cohen was so frightening to the president was he was the holder of documentary evidence. He's also the holder of audio evidence. So there's going to be more coming out, and then of course with the Mueller report there'll be more text messages, phone records, that sort of thing. I don't know if the Democrats believe, who hold a House, who have to write the bill of impeachment, believe lying about an affair is going to carry the political weight that it needs to in order to get a bill of impeachment and Senate trial. I think, however, there is certainly a crime. I believe Chairman Cummings when he said it appears that there has been a crime committed while he was president, which, remember, all of the other statements and things were before, when he was campaigning. He lied to the American people. He committed a campaign finance violation before. This check, this reimbursement, is while he's president.
That's where I was going with this too. It seems to me that what were the facts that really came out that we weren't aware of? I felt that this hearing just devolved into a partisan back and forth, and where were the facts? What did we learn new after this hearing, and what does that lead next?
I don't think we learned anything that we did not already know. I'm not sure that we did, but we have to think about kind of what the standard for impeachment here is in the United States. And of course, I don't know if the Democrats, if their major goal was to begin setting the stage, but many people think that, in fact, perhaps it was. This may be one tiny building block, but by itself, that one check or even most of the information that was given would not rise to that level. If you look at the history of even the provision allowing for presidential impeachments, if you look at it very closely, it's clear that it's not really meant to deal with the types of federal crimes that were perhaps revealed during Wednesday's testimony. But one very important part of it is that it was made to deal with, or rather, let me say it like this. If the president has obtained the presidency by corrupt means, that in itself would be an impeachable offense. And so I think that they're trying to build the building blocks to that, but none of the particular evidence that was given during Wednesday's hearing does that in and of itself. And that's a very important point that we need to keep in mind.
Did anything that Michael Cohen said this past week change how the president's base will feel about him?
It's a good question. I do believe, unfortunately, that there is a large number of people who support the president who would support him if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue. And he was very prescient when he said that. How he knew that his base would support him through all of these various accusations, I don't know. I thought that the Republican House members failed in their duty to their constituents and to the country. As a trial lawyer, I don't think what they did was tried to obtain facts, tried to elicit factual testimony from a very, very key witness. I think what they tried to do was attack credibility. There's a place for attacking credibility in a trial. You always do that. But first, in almost a discovery proceeding, you're wanting to get the facts. I do think it was pretty important that he said, "I heard the president talk to Roger Stone about the Julian Assange email drop." I do think that was a game changer for information that the country now has.
And there was a suggestion that he may have been informed by his son, that the president may have been informed by Don Jr. about the meeting with
Trump
the
Tower
Russians,
meeting.
Trump Tower. But it was just a suggestion, right? As an attorney, as a professor of law, what did you make of that suggestion, assertion, whatever you would call it?
Well, the way that he said it sounded to me as if he and the president would often, they had their own kind of language that they often use with each other, and that look in the eye and the repetition of the story back to him was his cue to then change the story to what the president wanted it to be.
You're talking about Cohen's testimony to Congress. Okay.
I'm talking about Cohen's testimony where he said that that Trump looked at him and said, "Here is what you should, not what you should say," but he gave them the indication that you should say a certain thing a certain way.
Right.
So in the Trump Tower, so he was meeting with Donald Trump, and Don Jr. comes behind the desk,
right,
and he whispers to him, but he can hear. And he says the meeting is all set up. Now, I think that led to the credibility of Michael Cohen. Because if Michael Cohen was the rat that he's been accused of, he would have said, I've scheduled the meeting with the Russians. He could have added a word, but he didn't. He said, I only heard this. It's close in time and prior to the supposed Trump Tower meeting. Well, we all know the Trump Tower meeting happened. It's whether Donald Trump knew it happened. So I thought that lent credibility to his testimony.
So if he was going to make something up, why not make up a
That's the big thing.
I get
That's
you.
the molar.
All right, we need to take a break. When we continue, the president's North Korean summit with Kim Jong-un and the tough, delicate art of diplomacy. That's when we return in just a moment.